enthusiastically chanting. I want to welcome everybody to the first New England Marxist conference at Harvard University, which, as of Wednesday night, is now occupied. I think the Harvard administration is learning firsthand, that it's far easier to close the gates of Harvard Yard than to shut down a movement. And certainly it was far easier for them to shut the gates of Harvard Yard than to stop our conference from happening today. We're not really going anywhere. This is an incredibly exciting time, I think, to be at a conference on Marxism. I think it's a time when the realities of struggle, I think both locally and globally, far exceed, I think, what we thought and even hoped would occur this year. One example I want to start with is, about a year ago I was meeting with somebody else at Harvard, and we were lamenting the fact that there was an anti-choice group on campus that had set up flags representing the numbers of babies killed an hour. And we met at a restaurant in Harvard Square, and we were just lamenting the fact that there was really no organized left presence on campus, and we really couldn't do very much, just the two of us, to respond, to these anti-choice bigots. It's, I think, really incredible to think now that a year later, there's not only a fighting left at Harvard, but there is a whole tent city of people in Harvard Yard committed to fighting to end the atrocities that Harvard commits as a corporation. I think it would have been even harder to imagine that this occupation at Harvard would have been one of hundreds of occupations occurring throughout the U.S. And I think it would have been even harder than that to imagine this occupation movement would be preceded by massive protests and an ongoing occupation of the State House in Madison, Wisconsin last winter. But I think perhaps it would have been hardest to imagine that just under a year ago, a man setting himself on fire in Tunisia would literally set the Middle East ablaze and culminate in the largest revolution in human history. Needless to say, we find ourselves in a moment where many people, who've grown up knowing nothing but the brutality and degradation of capitalism are for the first time questioning the inevitability of the system and protesting the havoc it's brought to the planet and to the majority of the people who live on it. So in short, I want to welcome everyone to the first New England Marxist conference. As resistance across the globe has shown us, capitalism is in fact not the pinnacle of human history, but a source of misery and grief for all but a tiny elite that really belongs to the dustbin of history. Furthermore, there's an alternative to capitalism. It's called socialism. We invite you to find out more about it in the hopes that you'll join us in bringing capitalism to its knees. Because the system isn't working, and we have a better world to win. Before Ashley begins the opening plenary and sort of kicks off a really exciting weekend-long conference. There's going to be no discussion following Ashley's talk. All of the other sessions obviously will be talks followed by sort of questions and discussions. But because this is an abbreviated session, we'll move right on to lunch. And then all of the sessions afterwards will be happening in this building because Harvard, for the first time since, as I said, since '69, has completely locked down the yard. We are scary, so I don't blame them. But I'll go through where different workshops are later. But so really the only other thing I want to do now is go through the registration packet and just direct people to it. There is a schedule. There will be slight modifications that I'll explain afterwards. There's information for various branches throughout New England. There's food information. There's a map. There's also a pledge fund drive form, which somebody will talk more about later, and a form for subscriptions to the International Socialist Review, which is a really excellent publication that we'll be talking more about later. So with all of that said, I'm going to wrap up. I just want to introduce Ashley, who will be giving the first talk. Ashley Smith is a longtime socialist and anti-war activist. He's a frequent contributor to the International Socialist Review and a member of its editorial board. He writes for Socialist Worker and is a member of the National Writers Union. So please help me in welcoming Ashley.
Living in historic times. I literally can't believe that Harvard University is occupied. When you think about it, this is a bastion of the 1%, and it's occupied. This is where George Bush was spawned, and it's occupied. And the slogan of the Harvard occupation is, "We want a university for the 99%. Harvard University is occupied. And you know that they're scared. So scared that a bunch of students chanted at the occupation, "We are the 1%. Imagine that! The 1% are having to learn how to counter-protest against us. Because we are the 99% and they're the 1%. Boy, does that 1% deserve what they're getting and beginning to get from us. For the last 30 years, they've busted our unions, driven down our wages and benefits, divided and conquered us, used racism, sexism, homophobia, immigrant bashing to produce savage inequalities in our society, unbelievable inequalities. They let the free market rip for the last 30 years, and it was a boom for them. The top 1% of our society owned 40% of the wealth. The top 20%, 80% of the wealth. Meanwhile, for the rest of us, it has been a bust for the last 30 years. We have just gotten hammered, and we're working longer and harder for less money, and students today face a lifetime of debt peonage, an indentured servitude to banks. That's what they've done for the last 3 decades. But now, I think we have to say, their free market party is over. The Great Recession of 2008 tipped the world economy into a protracted global slump. And nothing that the bosses have done and are doing today is turning it around. Let's just look at Europe right now, where literally Greece and Italy are about to go bankrupt. And what are the bosses of Europe doing? They're firing the democracy and installing bankers' governments. Unelected bankers are being installed as the governments in Italy and in Greece. The only good thing about that is Silvio Berlusconi is going to be gone on board. Is Monti, his replacement, is a banker. And he's going to impose austerity measures. And so there's got to be an occupation in Italy, too, that begins to rise up against the new banker's government. If 2008 was a year of crisis that has really opened a whole new period in human history, 2011 has been a year of resistance. Our response to their crisis. Resistance, class struggle, and yes, the specter of revolution, which has been risen in all of the Middle East. From one corner of the globe to the other, we have amazing struggle. That is, it's hard to count. There was a video that went around on the internet, I don't know if people saw it, 2011, a year in struggle, and it's a turning globe with flashpoints of strikes, demonstrations, protests, occupations. The world is lit up. Because from one corner of the world to the other, people are in struggle. In Greece in particular, I have lost count of the number of general strikes in Greece. At last count, I think it was 17 general strikes they've had in the last 2 years. But think about that. All that struggle, and the bankers' government is still going to impose the austerity measures, still going to cut pensions, still going to lay people off. To do what? To bail out German and French banks. Despite all that struggle, they're still carrying through this austerity measures. But the reality is that's only stoking the fires of resistance, which are spreading from Greece throughout Europe, even Britain, which perhaps was one of the working classes that was most flattened by Thatcher in the 1980s. They now have a general strike on November 30th that's been called. And there are wildcat strikes that are being planned around that general strike. But the most dramatic example is what happened in Tunisia, what happened in Egypt. Because 30, 40 years of dictatorships in the space of a month, in the space of 15 days, were toppled by mass popular demonstrations, occupations of Tahrir Square, strikes by workers on the Suez Canal that tipped the balance and overthrew the regime of Hosni Mubarak. And they set an example for the world, and I think awaken the world that you can resist, you can fight, and yes, you can even win. So that in Madison, Wisconsin, when I was there during the occupation that really was the first occupation in the United States, the occupation of the Capitol building in Madison, Wisconsin, people were walking around with placards that said, "Walk like an Egyptian, strike like an Egyptian, revolt like an Egyptian." Imagine that. Talk about one of the most demonized sections of our world, the Arab Middle East, Muslim population, people in Green Bay, people in Madison, identifying with Arabs and Muslims as their brothers and sisters and despising their governor, what's his name, Scott Walker, and saying, renaming him Scott Hosni Mubarak Walker, showing that there's more we have in common across borders than with our own ridiculous governors in all these different states. So the Egyptian working class really set an example. And since Madison, since that occupation of the Capitol building, we've had a ripple of struggle across the United States. The Verizon workers' strike, the protest to stop the execution of Troy Davis, the slut walks that have happened all across the United States that have risen the specter of a new women's movement to defend abortion rights, stop rape culture. And I think, obviously, the most dramatic is the emergence for the first time of open class struggle in the form of Occupy Wall Street.
Right.
Occupy movement has galvanized and awakened workers, young workers, students who are going to end up in the working class, students who are also workers and going to school, and unemployed people, people desperate for a job. It has awakened, stirred them into struggle in a way that nothing has for around 30, 40 years. And the most important thing about this movement is the enemy has been named. The enemy has been named. The 1%, Wall Street, the corporations, the banks, and that is like a lightning rod for all the grievances that have been building up for the last 30, 40 years. The slogan, they got bailed out, we got sold out. That everybody can identify who's part of the 99%, who's part of the working class. And it's not only awakened workers as a whole, it's awakened every section of the oppressed population in our society. So now we have black neighborhoods that have Occupy the Hood, developing in Harlem, developing here in Roxbury. We also have an initiative that one of our comrades here in Boston helped with called Ocupemos el Barrio. That is, occupation is beginning to develop. And every time this movement gets repressed, it gets bigger. I mean, it's really incredible. And for me, who've been through a lot of movements, when we get in a bad situation, usually the movement retreats a little bit. But every moment of police brutality and repression has spurred the movement to new heights. And it began with Mayor Bloomberg, the billionaire mayor of New York City, the Berlusconi of New York, really, you gotta call him. When Bloomberg threatened to shut down the occupation in Zuccotti Park, what happened was incredible. I have never seen an emergency email from the AFL-CIO in my life. Not only did they send out 2 emergency emails, but they said, you have to defend Zuccotti Park, and then there was an emergency call at midnight. Go to Zuccotti Park and defend the occupation. This is the first time since Seattle in 1999 that the trade union movement has openly identified and joined militant street struggle. This is a huge barrier that we're crossing. And so what happened with Bloomberg? Oh, got to retreat. Can't take on the unions, and the occupation united against the administration in New York City. And that has stirred people into solidarity really ever since then. So now we have occupations all around the world, because everything that happens in New York, you know, Sherry can talk about it, it's a broadcast to the whole world. Everybody knows what happens in New York. So you have a defense of the occupation, and it's beamed around the planet. So you have people in Tahrir Square marching in support of the occupation in Zuccotti Park. So it's going back and forth around the world. In Palestine, people marched with the slogan, Occupy Wall Street, not Palestine. photograph from Antarctica, that Antarctica is now occupied. So we have all 7 continents now have occupations. And, you know, the 1% is shaking in its boots. The Democratic Party in particular is bipolar on the question. They don't know whether to cheer it or repress it. You know, really. So you've got Obama saying, I feel your pain. And then you've got Cuomo, the mayor of Providence, the mayor of Chicago, Rahm Emanuel, who's an IDF officer. Then you've got the mayor of Oakland, California. What do? Send in the cops. So which side is the Democratic Party on? It seems profoundly confused. 1% or 99%? In the end, I think it's with the 1%, but I'll talk about that in a moment. But all those attempts at repression, as I said, have stirred further resistance to new heights. So look at what happened in Oakland, California. I think this crystallizes everything that's wrong in our world and everything that we're right about and everything that we're doing right about. The mayor of Oakland, Kwan, tried to shut down the occupation of Oscar Grant Park. And what did people do in response? They tried to defend the park, but when they tried to do that, brutalized Scott Olson, somebody who did two tours of duty in Iraq. And what does he come back to? Homelessness, unemployment, no benefits that the GI plan promised him. And what do the cops do? They brutalize him, send him to the hospital with a beating to the point where he can barely speak. So that would be pretty intimidating. What happens the next day? Thousands of people turn out. And they reoccupy. Barricades and rebuild them into a beautiful work of art. They do a sculpture, an installation made out of police barricades. Let's do that with all police barricades. We can make their ugly world beautiful. And then what happened at the General Assembly meeting was a call for a general strike in Oakland. I was like, wow. A general strike? I haven't heard that word. Well, in Madison you did hear that word. But on a national scale, a discussion of a general strike in America, profoundly amazing. And what happened? 15,000 people marched on the port in the Bay Area. And they shut down the port with the support of the Longshoremen's Union, the ILWU. The port in the Bay Area was shut down by our movement. And all of them are talking about, well, we got to take care of this. We got to get them off the streets. We got to put the genie back in the bottle. But we've got another action coming up on November 17th, where the unions in New York City are threatening, and will do this, to march across the Brooklyn Bridge in their fundamentally altered American class consciousness. It is stunning. The results from this week's election, I usually don't follow elections. Well, I do. But it's not what animates me in my life. But this week's referendum are incredible. In Ohio, a decisive defeat for the governor's attempt to do a Wisconsin to the Ohio trade unions. It was decisively defeated by a vote of the working class against the Ohio trade unions. And I was blown away by this. In Mississippi, where the right wing is trying to push through a referendum to grant personhood to fetuses at conception, the majority of voters defeated that in a referendum. There is a sea change in consciousness going on, and there is a sea change in struggle going on. And amidst this new movement, a specter is rising. A specter that has always haunted the bourgeoisie. And that is the face of Karl Marx. Marx is back. He's back because he's right. I hope many of you have on your Facebook page that little image of Marx. And he said, I told you I was right. And in little letters it says capitalism. That's gone wildfire all over Facebook. It's incredible that you've got, in a country that has such a history of anti-communism, a new identification with Marx as a dude, but also with Marxism. You know, it's quite incredible. And the most amazing example of this is from Orange County in Southern California, which has to be one of the most reactionary places on the planet, to be honest. And the Orange County Weekly described this scene, which I almost cried when I read this. This is what the OC Weekly said. A clever 20-something Asian-American protester placed the image of Karl Marx's head on a cardboard cutout of a ghost but added no words. As he waved the sign at passing horn-honking motorists, he explained his point. The ghost of Karl Marx is back, you know. Wall Street should be very afraid. That's what we're saying. Corporations are abusing the masses. They continued. He wasn't alone. Scattered throughout the crowd were people in black t-shirts bearing Marx's face. One person even carried a sign reading, "Marx was right," the topic of this meeting. That's incredible. What is going on in Orange County? I mean, this is amazing. This is the birthplace of the John Birch Society. And people are marching in Marx t-shirts. That's quite a profound shift, I have to say, in Orange County. But that goes for everywhere. In Occupy Chicago, there was an amazing, Marx is back in the occupation in Chicago. There was, I think Marx could never dream that this happened to his great book, The Communist Manifesto. The Occupy Chicago had a teach-in on the Communist Manifesto. And they did it with a bullhorn with 150 people. So somebody gave a 10-minute talk on the manifesto, and then they passed the bullhorn around for 2 hours because everybody's read the manifesto and never read it in a real way, when it really matters, like it matters right now, because the manifesto so describes our world. So Marx is back, not only the image, but the content is coming back within our in the very heart of our movement. Marx is coming back because people are looking for an alternative. This world sucks. And what's the alternative to this mess? What's the alternative? People are desperate to find out what that alternative is. Certainly the 1% has no clue what an alternative would be. When you look at what they're doing, everything our rulers have done have failed. I used to joke about George Bush having the reverse Midas touch, that everything he touched turned to lead. Really, our ruling class has the reverse Midas touch. Everything they've done has turned to lead. They really look like they're rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. They said in the 1980s that there was no alternative. That's what Margaret Thatcher's slogan was. Tina, there is no alternative. And they let the free market rip, as I've described. Well, the free market has crashed. And overnight, they've given up the ghost of the idea that the free market can work on its own. What did all these free marketeers do overnight? They turned into supporters of state intervention to save their banks, save their corporations, bail out the billionaires, and then screw us in the process. They've all become advocates of state intervention to save the system. I think that Thatcher, thank God she's gone, but I can't imagine what she'd be thinking if she was alive today. She'd probably be advocating state intervention to save British capitalism. So they're utter hypocrites when it really comes down to it. But all that state intervention, the $16 trillion they spent in the United States, bailing out the banks and the corporations to get the economy going again, it has failed. We have an inching along economy that may go into a recession in the coming months and years. And now, what has happened is all the problems of the private economy have been transferred to the state economy. So now we have massive deficit, massive debts. And what are they doing? They're saying to us, everywhere, every county, every state, the whole country, every country around the world, you have to pay for this crisis. We are going to take it out of your wages, your benefits, we're going to take it out of your jobs, we're going to lay you off, we're going to make you pay for the crisis so we can get the system going all over again. In the United States, this strategy by the bosses has caused American politics to go bananas. I mean, really, American politics is out to lunch. The Democrats have become Republicans, and the Republicans have become lunatics. Think about it. The Democrats, who are supposed to be the party of the 99%, are the architects of the budget cuts in most of the states around the country. Jerry Brown in California, Andrew Cuomo in New York, I'm sure, what's his name here? Deval Patrick. They're imposing the cuts. Obama's talking about ripping up Medicare and Social Security. That's what this deficit reduction plan that they're going to come up with is going to do. And then you look at the Republicans. I mean, this is like the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse who are running for president. I mean, Bachmann? I mean, Jesus. Harry? He's not only a 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, he's a moron. He can't even remember what departments of government he wants to cut. Kane, serial sexual harasser and reactionary. And then you've got perhaps the most boring candidate in human history, Mitt Romney. He's right up there with... As a result of this weird situation in American politics, people have utterly lost faith in the government. There was a Reuters poll, I don't know if people read this Reuters poll, but they did a poll to find out what percent of Americans think that the government has the consent of the governed. They found 17% of Americans think the U.S. government has the consent of the governed. The Reuters pollster, I think, lost his mind when he saw this figure, and he said, which is not true, but he said this in his report and analysis, he said Americans have pre-revolutionary consciousness. I mean, think about that. The ruling class and their journalists are a little bit worried. There's no people don't support what's going on in our society at all. Our rulers are really at loss in this situation. So, in this situation, who are the rulers turning to? Not just us that are turning to Karl Marx. They are turning to Karl Marx. Because their bourgeois economics doesn't explain or solve the crisis, so they got to go to the source. They got to go to Capital, the Communist Manifesto, to understand how capitalism works. You think I'm joking? Just read the Wall Street Journal. Just read the business press. They're so confused by the system they are supposedly running that they have to read the main opponent of the system in the history of capitalism, Karl Marx, to get a clue about what's going on. I'm really not kidding. In Bloomberg's main website, financial press website, this story in Bloomberg, this is the billionaire mayor, his corporation ran this story entitled, "Give Karl Marx a chance to save the world economy." And then the story reads this way. Policymakers struggling to understand the barrage of financial panic, protests, and other ills affecting the world would do well to study the works of a long-dead economist, Karl Marx. Consider, for example, Marx's prediction of how the inherent conflict between capital and labor would manifest itself. As he wrote in Das Kapital, companies' pursuit of profits and productivity would naturally lead them to need fewer and fewer workers, creating an industrial reserve army of the poor and unemployed. Accumulation of wealth at one pole is therefore, at the same time, an accumulation of misery. The process he describes is visible throughout the developed world, particularly in the United States. Companies' efforts to cut costs and avoid hiring have boosted U.S. corporate profits as a share of total economic output to the highest level in more than 6 decades, while the unemployment rate stands at 9.1% and real wages are stagnant. U.S. income inequality, meanwhile, is by some measures close to its highest level since the 1920s. And the thing goes on. I mean, this is like digesting for the business press what Marx wrote in Capital. It goes on. Marx also pointed out the paradox of overproduction and underconsumption. The more people are relegated to poverty, the less they will be able to consume all the goods and services companies produce. When one company cuts costs to boost earnings, it's smart, but when they all do, they undermine the income formation and effective demand on which they rely for revenues and profits. I actually can't believe this. This is incredible. This problem, too, is evident in today's developed world. We have a substantial capacity to produce, but in the middle class and lower income cohorts, we find widespread financial insecurity and low consumption rates. The result is visible in the United States, where new housing construction and automobile sales remain at about 75% and 30% below their 2006 peaks, respectively. As Karl Marx put it in Das Kapital, the ultimate reason for all real crises always remains the poverty and restricted consumption of the masses. Mic check? What is going on? What is going on? And it's not just in Bloomberg. It's Nouriel Roubini, who is the main bourgeois economist who predicted this crisis. He's one of the few who predicted this crisis. And the bourgeois press nicknamed him Dr. Doom. So they said, this guy's wrong. He's just got a problem with being, depressed all the time. It's not, has nothing to do with his analysis. But then he went on and said this to the Wall Street Journal in an interview. Karl Marx had it right. At some point, capitalism can destroy itself. You cannot keep on shifting income from labor to capital without having an excess capacity and a lack of aggregate demand. That's what's happened. We thought that markets worked. They're not working. The individual can be rational. The firm, to survive and thrive, can push labor costs more and more down, but labor costs are someone else's income and consumption. That's why it's a self-destructive process. So what has happened? Have these people like Saul on the road to Damascus suddenly had a revelation and become overnight Marxists? Absolutely not. In fact, what is happening would make Marx really turn in his grave. They're trying to figure out how to use Marxism to cure capitalism's ills and save the system. I mean, that's like, too bad we don't have Howard Zinn, because we need Howard Zinn to do a new edition of Marx in Soho that updates Marx's response to the banker's attempt to use his ideas to solve the ills of capitalism. Because Marx's whole point was, capitalism is the problem. There can be no really good capitalism. It sucks by definition. And the only solution is working class revolution. That's his whole political tradition. That's what we stand in. So Marx was right, and the world is proving him right before our very eyes. Marx argued a few simple things about capitalism that are profoundly true today. Marx argued that capitalism was built on exploitation, that a tiny minority exploited the vast majority to get those workers to make products, provide services, and therefore make profits for that tiny 1% that owns and controls absolutely everything. They are rich because we are poor. We are poor because they are rich. The structure of exploitation is at the heart of this system. And they have a state, they call it the government, I call it a state, that exists to defend that structure of inequality. That's why Marx called the state, the governments of the capitalist world, that he said that the states were the executive committee for managing the common affairs of the bourgeoisie. That is, they use the government to run the economy, to ensure profitability, and everybody knows what happens when they face struggle. They use the state to repress resistance. They use the state to repress strikers, to repress protesters, to keep the system in order. So that's a pretty foul beginning, but it gets even worse about all that's wrong with capitalism. Capitalism is an oppression machine. It relies not only on the oppression and exploitation of workers, it relies and depends on the oppression of all sorts of groups in our society that Marx, Engels, and the whole Marxist tradition have explained. Marx in Capital lays out how the ruling class used racism to justify slavery at the dawn of capitalism, and used racism ever since to divide and conquer the working class, to keep us fighting amongst each other instead of fighting our common enemies. They've used gender oppression to lock women into rearing kids, taking care of kids, so the state and the ruling class doesn't have to pay for it through privatized reproduction and the family. Engels wrote a brilliant book called Family, Private Property, and the State that lays this whole analysis out. That's the germ of an analysis of where homophobia comes from, the oppression of gay people under capitalism. And the list of oppressions goes on and on. Anti-immigrant racism, the oppression of the elderly.